You're going to revise, you're going to edit, so you are not aiming for perfection in this stage. You're just aiming for narration. Hey guys, I'm Michelle. Welcome back to my channel. If writing workshops and traditional publishing chat are your thing, please consider subscribing. Today's video is part 2 in a little series I wanted to do to address a few questions I've gotten on scene transitions and summary versus narration, putting the meat on the bones of your first draft so that it includes a strong narrative voice and dialogue and metaphors and similes and all that good stuff. It occurs to me as I'm saying this that we're really running right alongside the old show don't tell rule here. Or at least that's how it is for me in my process. When I'm in the early stages of writing a book, whether it's the outline or the zero draft, really in both, I'm telling the story. And then when I get to the first draft, I'm showing the story. And I really wish I had done this more back when I first started writing, because back then, the first few books I wrote, I would outline a little bit. I would have a general idea of what I wanted my scenes to be, but I would just jump into that first draft and fully expect myself to just nail it with great dialogue and a strong voice and all this other stuff. And that's just a whole lot of pressure to put on your first draft. It's a really good way to frustrate yourself to the point where you just quit writing your draft because it's not coming out on the page the way you see it in your head. So my first tip for you here is actually going to be kind of a preemptive step, one that I really wish I had done back then. No matter what your process is, whether you're a pantser or whether you're a strict outliner, or if you kind of have some beats lined up and then you write a zero draft before you write your first draft, whatever it is that you do when you're just telling the very first version of your story, you're just trying to get it out of your head and onto the page. If a metaphor or a line of dialogue or just a really unique turn of phrase, if they come to you, write them down. Even if you're questioning it, even if you're not sure it's right, write it down. Whatever comes to your head, write it down and include it in this early stage. You obviously don't have to keep it, and there's a good chance later on when you're ready to write the next draft of your story, you're gonna look at it and be like, oh, that's ridiculous. No, I'm gonna scrap that. But often you're gonna find that you created these beautiful little moments in your very, very early version of telling this story. And I have a theory, at least for me personally, as to why this is. I think it's because when I'm outlining and when I'm zero drafting, and I know I'm telling the story and I am not worried about anybody ever reading this, my brain is like, oh, okay, so we don't have to worry about writing good prose right now. So of course, that's when it throws out all of my best ideas to the front of my head. It's because I'm not doubting myself the way I always do when I'm writing a first draft that I know my critique partners or maybe my agent or even an editor are going to read. No one's gonna read my outlines or my zero drafts, so I can throw anything in there, no matter how bizarre or stupid or anything I think it is. And the thing is, like I said, often they're not stupid. They're really, really good because I was taking risks as a writer and I wasn't putting all that pressure on myself of,
what are people gonna think when they read this?
So give yourself permission to take risks in whatever your early, nobody's ever gonna read this version of your story is. Okay, so now let's get into how do we actually shape it? How do we turn it from a summary into narration? Again, when you start, remind yourself that even if the first draft is not the actual first version of your story, even if you did a zero draft, it's certainly not going to be the last version of your story. You're going to revise, you're going to edit, so you are not aiming for perfection in this stage. You're just aiming for narration. I think the most effective way for me to tell you how I do this is to actually show you how I do this. So while I've changed some details of the story for privacy reasons, I'm going to share with you the outline, zero draft, and first draft versions of a book that I ghost wrote earlier this year. I'll start with a few lines from the very beginning of the outline. Jessica and her parents have just moved from the suburbs to a tiny country town. They live in a small and rather old house at the end of a dirt road. Jessica's room is upstairs, and she can see the forest from one window and the church on a hill from the other. She doesn't look out that window often because the sight of the cemetery reminds her of Lizzie, her little sister who died earlier this year. Exposition. That's what this is, and that's great for an outline. That's what an outline needs to be. So now when I have this at this stage and I'm writing a zero draft, I'm still telling the story. I'm still going to use plenty of exposition, but I am starting to think of this as a scene. As in, we are now with Jessica in whatever moment this is that begins the story, and I need to find a way to share this important backstory and setting description information while still being anchored in time and in her mind. So I'm still not worried about voice, and I'm not worried about dialogue. I'm not worried about any of that yet. But I might try things, I might experiment a little bit if something really good kind of jumps out at me. So this zero draft pretty much always comes out messier than my outline, and that's good. I like messy at this stage. In fact, I really do my best to free write these and to challenge myself to keep my fingers moving on the keyboard until the scene is done and just keep rambling out anything that comes to me. So here's the very beginning of the zero draft of this book. Everybody said the best part about living in the country was the quiet. Grown-ups really loved the quiet. Jessica didn't understand it one bit. She liked noise. Not a lot of noise or a racket, or like when the garbage truck rolled down the street at 6 a.m. in their old suburb, or when her old neighbor spent hours in his garage drilling and hammering until mom had to take an aspirin. But the kind of noise that meant life. Silence was like the opposite of life to Jessica. Maybe this was why she thumped down the stairs a little louder than was really necessary. This new old house was echoey and small. From Jessica's room upstairs, she could see the forest in one direction and a hill with a church in the other. She didn't look out that window too often. There was an empty room next to Jessica's. Her parents were using it to store all the boxes they hadn't unpacked yet. It was definitely quiet. Jessica hated it. So before I started writing this, I had already decided on third person past. I was thinking from Jessica's point of view. This is a girl whose little sister has recently died and she's still grieving and adjusting. So I was thinking not just about how to describe her new home, but how she would describe it being in the mindset that she's currently in. And that focus on quiet, that was just what my brain came up with at the moment. The order of this scene doesn't make sense. It kind of reads like it starts as if she's in her room and then she goes downstairs and then she's back in her room again, but that's okay. Again, the zero draft is going to be messy. I can easily fix that later. It's also really repetitive, and repetition is sometimes a really great literary device that you can use to great effect. In this case, it's just kind of annoying, but I was really just trying to play with different ways of the idea I was dancing around in my head, which was that Jessica is missing her sister. She's trying not to think about her sister, and she's focusing in instead on the quiet, which is a constant reminder that her sister isn't there. So now let's look at the first draft version and talk about how I got from this zero draft to the first draft. The best part about living in the country was the quiet. At least that's what all the grown-ups said. Oh, it's so quiet here. Don't you just love soaking up all this peace and quiet? I just love this quiet. So relaxing. Jessica didn't get it. She liked noise. Not big noise like when the garbage truck would roll down the street at 6 in the morning in their old neighborhood, or when Mr. McDuff next door would spend hours in his garage drilling and hammering and buzzsawing until mom started popping aspirin. Jessica liked a little noise. Toy cars ramming into walls, the chatter of dolls at a tea party, the kind of noise that meant life. She woke up Saturday morning to deafening silence. Climbing out of bed, Jessica hurried to the window that faced the forest and threw it open. A warm breeze carried in the sound of birds chirping in the trees. There was another window in her room, but that one faced the church on the hill surrounded by tiny tombstones, so Jessica tended to avoid it. She dressed quickly and headed to the stairs, passing the only other bedroom on the second floor. The unlived-in bedroom that Mom and Dad were using to store all the boxes they hadn't unpacked yet. It was very quiet upstairs, and Jessica hated it. Maybe that was why she thumped down the stairs a little louder than was actually necessary. Their new house, which was actually an old house, wasn't big, but it was extremely echoey. So there's still repetition in there in regards to the silence, but it's a little more spread out. The quiet is on Jessica's mind because her sister isn't there. I used dialogue at the beginning to kind of break things up a bit and give examples of exactly the kinds of things that Jessica overheard adults saying. And I also gave some more specific examples like the chatter of dolls and the toy cars, of the kinds of sounds that Jessica missed. Again, the point of all of this, the mention of the tombstones, all of this stuff, is to describe the setting so you can start to see a picture in your mind, but the purpose of all of it is pointing to the loss of Jessica's sister. So you're one page in as a reader and you have a pretty good idea of what's going on with this girl, but I, or the narrator, we haven't outright stated it yet because Jessica is trying not to think about it. Is this final draft worthy? No. I would still do a lot of editing after this stage. But to me, this is a perfectly acceptable first draft. I know that's kind of easier said than done, so I've got a workshop exercise for you to try that I think will really help you get a little bit better at taking your zero draft and turning it into a first draft. And that is, I want you to reverse engineer it. Take a novel that you really love and you know really well, and find a scene in there that you think is an exceptional example of how great this author is. Now, whether you want to write by hand or type it, free write a summary of what happens in that scene and just get all of it out of your head. Like what about this scene really hit you the first time you read it? What happens in this scene? What action takes place? What conversations happen? What things are revealed? And this is a really important part, what happens, what's underlying that the author doesn't say, but that you as the reader pick up on, whether it's tension between two characters or hints or foreshadowing at things that you know happen later in the story. Everything that's important about this scene, free write it into a summary. Then go back and read the scene in that book. And remind yourself, this is a scene in a published novel, so it's been revised and edited and copy edited and polished to a shine. And really analyze, how did the author convey all of that stuff in your summary to you through the words in this scene? How did they do it with dialogue? How did they do it through the narrator? How did they do it with the way they turned a phrase? How did they do it with metaphors and similes? Anything you can notice, write it down. Actually analyze it. Make like a bullet point list of all the things the author did that made this scene so amazing and told you all of this information that you got in your summary. Analyzing the work of authors you admire, like not just reading it for fun, but actually analyzing it this way, is one of the best things you can do to improve your own prose. That's it for this video. If you found this helpful, I'd appreciate it if you hit that like button, and I hope you guys have a wonderful week. I will see you Friday with another vlog, and until then, keep writing.